Today we have a very special guest for you guys. We are joined by Kay Nelson. He is a Marine, historian, diver, and author of Killing Shore, the true story of Hitler's U-boats off the New Jersey coast, which you can buy in the links below. Thank you for joining us, Kay. How are you doing today?
Hey, doing great. It's really great to be here. I've been a fan of your content for a while. I think you and your viewers are going to enjoy the fun, interesting story that we're going over today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, I think this should be a lot of fun, and I think everyone should learn a lot from this. So I guess to start off, how did you get interested in the whole topic of U-boats and the U-boat warfare off America's coast?
So it's really a convergence of interests for me. I am a longtime war history aficionado, as I know you are. And in addition to that, I'm an avid scuba diver, and I've also always had an interest in what might be considered local history. These things kind of and really converged. And it was when I realized that this topic, it just hasn't had very much written about it. There hasn't been, relatively speaking, compared to other World War II topics, there hasn't been a wide body of scholarship around this subject. So I realized that in addition to the subjects being interesting, that this is really, there's a story, or more accurately, many stories here that haven't really been told or haven't really been done justice. So it's one thing to find a subject you're interested in. It's another thing to find the opportunity to really tell the story for the first time. Now, that's not so much the case with this story that I'm going to share today is it's not necessarily forgotten history, but this whole topic of U-boat operations along the East Coast and in the Western Hemisphere is very much an underserved one, and it's not high on the list of things people are familiar with. So the topic as a whole is obscure, not necessarily forgotten, but so I found an opportunity. The short answer is to write something for the first time.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you said it's not a very well-known topic because even as someone I felt like I knew relatively a decent amount about U-boats and everything. The whole focus, is U-boats in the Atlantic off England and stuff like that. A lot of people don't realize U-boats were literally off America's beaches and surfacing and making attacks in front of people on beaches on America's actual shores. And it's very interesting to me how a lot of people don't even know that any of that stuff happened.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, firstly, I should say that I thought I had a pretty good understanding going into this of that topic. And even I realized that there was so much more there than I was aware of earlier. The other thing is that really the genesis of this project, and it's always hard to answer when people ask, well, what made you do this? Because as I mentioned, there are a number of factors, but I think more than anything else, the genesis was in the course of conversation, like at work, somebody would say, hey, what'd you do this weekend? I said, oh, I went and I was diving this wreck off New Jersey on Saturday. And they go, oh, what kind of wreck? It's it was a ship that got torpedoed in World War II. And inevitably, I kept getting the same response of, wait, what? There were German submarines off the coast? And I realized that this topic is not only interesting to me, but there's considerable latent interest among others as well. Latent interest meaning you didn't even know that you were interested in it because you didn't know it existed.
Yeah, that is a great point. Yeah, it is amazing how people don't realize that there was an entire war just happening miles offshore here. And how did you come to find out about this actual topic here today? Because I didn't know about it until somewhat recently. And when I found out about it, I was like, how have I never heard about this event before?
Yeah. So this was part of my research for my book, which I'll talk a little bit about just to provide a better context for the story itself. But the my book is about its nominal subject is U-boats off the Jersey Shore, but the book is really the content's much broader than that, and it really covers U-boat operations in the Western Hemisphere with a special emphasis on events that occurred near New Jersey. So this came up in the course of my research. I was aware of it before without necessarily knowing all the details. And I did a little bit of research on it before I started the book because I got to dive this wreck for the first time in 2020, which it was one of my diving goals, especially when I moved back to the East Coast. So I read up a bit about it before I dove the wreck the first time, but this story ended up getting about a page worth of content in my book. And it was in the course of writing that I went much deeper, no pun intended, into this incident. So everything that you're going to see today really came from my research notes. And it's such a longer version of what you'll see at the end of chapter 11 in Killing Shore.
Awesome. Well, again, no pun intended, but let's dive right into this event right here.
Let's do it. All right. So I already touched on the book. I appreciate you bringing that up front. It came out in April 2024. This was entirely a do-it-yourself project on my part. It took exactly 3 years of work from the day I started until the day that the final manuscript went to press. And I was working on it, of course, up until just a few minutes before I sent the final version off. So this conversation that we're having here is part of my publicity tour, if you will, over the last few months. I've been fortunate enough to speak at a number of different venues, LA Times Festival of Books, Johns Hopkins was a big one, and some of those have been recorded and are on my YouTube channel. So that's the link that I put on the last slide. But that's the extent. I'm not here to pitch the book. I want to tell the story, and this is just kind of the context of how I ended up, with all these facts about it in my notes. So without further ado, we will proceed. So the date is 9 May 1942. This is about 4 months after the first U-boats reached the East Coast, which was on 14 January. The intervening weeks have been nothing short of a massacre. This has already, by May, turned into, as it remains today, the single worst naval defeat in American history. Essentially, the Germans arrived to find the East Coast almost completely undefended. There was also permissive operating conditions off the Canadian Maritimes and in the Caribbean. So since January, the U-Boot-Waffe has been having a field day along the entirety of North America and even down as far as the northern part of South America. So the cost has been absolutely dreadful. Finally, now here in the first half of May 1942, things have started to turn around a bit. The Germans are realizing that this operating theater is no longer as permissive as it once was, but those facts aren't at all clear to either side at this point. So the Americans are still hard pressed. They are still actually by this point, a few days away from putting the first part of their coastal convoy system into action. So the Germans are still very much on the prowl along the East Coast. So the tide has started to turn, but we're still very much in the heat of things. Now, I mentioned the cost having been particularly high up to this point. Part of what I like to do in my work is focus on the human dimension of things. So there were more than 100 ships that have been sunk up to this point between January and May, just in U.S. waters alone, not including Canada and the Caribbean. But there's obviously a human toll entailed in that. And as it stands, as of 9 May, within 400 nautical miles of U.S. shores, there have been nearly 2,000 merchant mariners killed, 371 U.S. servicemen, 107 from other allied countries, and 127 civilian passengers. That is, civilians who are not merchant mariners. This number is only going to continue to increase. In fact, there are several hundred more fatalities that have yet to occur. And part of what has made this so frustrating for leadership in the U.S. naval establishment is that we have taken such heavy losses over the last few months, and we have almost nothing to show for it in terms of U-boats destroyed. So as of today, 9 May 1942, there has only been a single U-boat sunk in American waters. That was the U-85 off North Carolina, which was sunk in April, with no survivors. But other than the U-85, we simply have been taking it much worse than we have been able to give it. So U-85 was sunk off North Carolina, and speaking of that state, there are a few places along North America that have that are sometimes referred to as the graveyard of the Atlantic, but probably none of those places have a better claim to that title than the waters off North Carolina. The same factors that have made these waters so dangerous over centuries past are actually the same ones that have now made it the epicenter of U-boat activity along the eastern seaboard. By war's end, there will be about 55%, in fact, exactly 55% of U-boat attacks within 400 nautical miles of U.S. shores will occur off North Carolina alone. So in addition to its long-standing title of Graveyard of the Atlantic, merchant mariners by May of 1942 had given it another nickname, being Torpedo Junction. The ship that you see there on the left burning is a tanker called the Dixie Arrow. The sister ship of the Dixie Arrow, the India Arrow, was sunk off New Jersey a few months earlier, and that's actually the subject of chapter 6 of my book. So enter the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Icarus. This is a Thetis-class Coast Guard cutter. One of the kind of forgotten slice of this forgotten chapter of history is the significant role that the Coast Guard played during the U-boat offensive in American waters. They were absolutely indispensable, and they essentially were performing the same roles that the Navy was. So armed cutters running patrols, escorting convoys when that convoy system gets implemented, which is we're still not quite there. But one of these ships was the Coast Guard cutter Icarus. This is a Thetis-class cutter measuring 165 feet long, has a crew of about 50, and is reasonably well armed. The Icarus is under the command of a 52-year-old lieutenant named Maurice Jester. And Maurice Jester is well respected by his crew and by his peers, although he's considered a little bit aloof, but he is considerably older and more experienced than most O3s in the Coast Guard, or the Navy for that matter. So he has a significant degree of credibility. The afternoon of 9 May 1942 finds Jester's cutter, the Icarus, patrolling through Torpedo Junction. She's about 22 nautical miles south of Cape Lookout, and he is unaware, although is not necessarily going to be surprised, but he's unaware at that moment that there is also another vessel that is patrolling through the same waters, and that is the U-352. That's a Type 7C U-boat, which is the most numerous class of U-boat produced. And the U-352 has been in American waters for only about a week. And that boat is under the command of a 31-year-old named Helmut Ratka. Ratka was, unlike Jester, not very well liked by his crew. In fact, they widely despised him. He was considerably arrogant, and he was also a staunch Nazi. His crew, as I said, were not fond of him at all. But in addition to this, there's also a bit of desperation at play here, because Helmut Ratka still, after he's on his third patrol as a U-boat commander, and yet he still has not sunk a single ship. And obviously the amount of tonnage that a U-boat commander sunk that was the only metric that was important. That was how they were the only basis on which they are awarded medals. The tonnage sunk and number of ships sunk was a primary driving factor of whether the crew respected you. So he's here on his third patrol, hasn't sunk a single ship yet, and we're going to see very soon how that desperation influences the events that are to follow. So the afternoon, late in the afternoon of 9 May, the Icarus is patrolling. She's making about 14 knots on a southwesterly heading, again, south of Cape Lookout. And as she is cruising along, Jesters' sonar operator is pinging the surrounding water. There would have been only one sonar operator, unlike the picture. And so the cutter's making her way along, and the operator is sending these pulses of ultrasonic energy into the water and listening for return. Pretty routine behavior, or pretty routine conduct for a ship on patrol. It's at 16:20 when suddenly the sonar operator gets a return. He's getting a good echo bouncing back off something that's underwater. This doesn't set off any alarm bells, partly because there are false positives that are detected all the time. There are, of course, a large number of shipwrecks off North Carolina, as well as throughout the entirety of the eastern seaboard. And those can oftentimes produce false returns from sonar. There's also all sorts of underwater phenomena that can distort sound waves and cause them to seemingly indicate something that isn't there. So they get a contact at 16:20, but it's a pretty clear contact, which isn't always the case, but again, doesn't really set off any alarm bells. The Icarus is continuing on her way, and about 7 or 8 minutes pass when suddenly the entire ship shudders from an explosion that's very nearby in the water. What has happened is what the crew see is a jet of water, spout of water, about 200 to 300 yards off the starboard quarter, or port quarter, excuse me. And what has happened, unbeknownst to them, is that they have been targeted. Helmut Ratka has fired a torpedo at the Icarus, but due to reasons that have never really been determined, that torpedo malfunctioned and detonated early. I myself still haven't even figured out exactly what went wrong here, but he fired just a single torpedo at the Icarus. Something happened. It didn't hit the ship, but it did detonate about 300 yards off the port quarter. And suddenly this throws the ship into action, of course. This is not normal behavior. This isn't an accident. Somebody has just narrowly avoided annihilating the ship. So immediately Jester doubles back and heads back for the spot that he believes it might have been fired from. Now, Ratka, at this moment, just a few hundred yards away, he has now gone from the cusp of his first victory, maybe, to, oh shit, very quickly. Because as I've said before, there's a reason that submarines of this era would usually avoid ships like a Coast Guard cutter or a destroyer. The reason being that if it is alerted to your presence, then you're in a world of hurt, because that ship has pretty much every advantage over that U-boat, except for surprise. And if the element of surprise is lost, like it is here, then that submarine's going to have a very bad day. So the Coast Guardsmen are not a hair aboard, not a hair on any head has been injured, but they are now been stirred into activity. Ratka realizes that he's got to act quickly. So what he does, he is remaining submerged. This is daylight, so he had attacked from underwater. Normally they would attack from the surface at night. So what he does is he makes a slow sprint, if you will, forward to the spot where that torpedo exploded. He's trying to hide in that disturbed water, hoping that the water might interfere with both sonar and from the hydrophone, and possibly or hopefully that's going to be the last place that the enemy looks, is exactly where that thing exploded. Unfortunately for Ratka, this is not what happened, because Jester knows exactly where he is. His sonar operator picks up the Germans once again. That cutter comes around in a sharp turn, and they're prepping the depth charges to be deployed. They have a Y gun, which you see on the left, that throws them, and they also have two racks on the stern that can roll them off. They pick up the U-boat again on sonar, and they run that thing down until the Icarus is almost directly on top of her. As they're cruising over, they drop a pattern of 5 depth charges. These are the equivalent of a direct hit, or very close to that. The pattern of 5, there was 3 from the rafts, or from the racks, and then 2 thrown by the Y gun. These detonate very close to the U-352, breaks the periscope, disables both E-motors, or fully disables one E-motor and mostly disables the other, and it actually kills the first watch officer in the tower. First watch officer is the second in command of the U-boat. The explosion actually threw his head forward into the instrument panel and killed him instantly. The boat's been heavily damaged. There's water coming in, so it's already a really bad situation for Ratka and his crew. And it's about to get even worse, because the Icarus comes around again, and he drops another pattern of depth charges. And after the second pattern, what this does is that the second pattern knocks the U-boat over onto its starboard side, and as it's flooding and the Ratka loses control of it, the stern actually sinks and it's scraping against the bottom. So the lights have also gone out inside the U-352, so it's absolute chaos aboard. The boat is now effectively out of their control, and the Coast Guardsmen are not done with them yet, because the Icarus then comes around, and so it was a third depth charge attack. This one was only 1 depth charge. I think they were probably running low. I'm not sure how many depth charges a Thetis-class cutter could carry, but it probably wasn't all that many. So they deliver a third attack with just 1 depth charge, and then they deliver a 4th attack with just another. By this point, Ratka's already realized that they have to abandon ship. He gives the order. A few of his men that are at their battle stations start to purge the ballast tanks to lighten the boat and get it to pop to the surface. The other men start donning their Draeger escape rebreather lungs. The Coast Guardsmen can see oil and bubbles coming up from where they've just dropped these depth charges, so they know that they have taken some good swings at the enemy, and the cutter swings around and is coming back toward them. Meanwhile, the U-352 is starting to slowly rise up to the surface. The Coast Guardsmen are watching as suddenly the bow of the U-boat actually breaks the water at about a 45-degree angle, and then the rest of it follows. They see the Coast Guardsmen see the tower hatch open, and Ratka's crew starts spilling out. Now, as often happened during these incidents, the ship that is attacking the U-boat usually is under the belief that they're surfacing to fight it out with their guns. I have never come across an incident where this actually happened, so I'm not entirely sure if that's ever happened where a U-boat surfaced and then fought it out on the surface. I've never come across it, but that was always what the destroyer cutter crewmen thought was happening. So when they see these Germans spilling out of the hatch, they let them have it. The 3-inch 23 caliber gun, which is essentially let's say 23 caliber. It's not a machine gun. It's the deck gun. It's actually a little bit smaller than the one picture on the left there, but the 3-inch gun is firing. There are 4 50 caliber machine guns that are shooting, 2 amidships and then 2 up at the bow. And there's also 2 30 cals up on the flying bridge. And the Coast Guardsmen are letting loose with everything that they have on the U-boat. What happens is the first 3-inch shell actually goes a little bit short, and it hits the deck, but not the tower, and it ricochets off the outer hull. The second 3-inch shell was just a little bit farther, but then the third one was dead on, and so were most of the subsequent shells that were fired. Ultimately, there would be estimated 7 out of 14 shells were a successful hit. So all this while, the Germans are still, as you could imagine, this is a little bit stressful. They're still spilling out of the tower and jumping overboard. Ratka as well. One of the Germans, a machinist not, he unfortunately gets hit with one of the 3-inch shells, and it takes most of his leg off. So eventually this U-boat, which is still afloat, but it's down by the bow and clearly going to go under shortly. There are 33 Germans that are in the water. Ratka pulls off his belt and makes it into a tourniquet to cinch up the leg of the guy who got hit with the 3-inch shell. And all the while, Ratka is yelling to his crew, say nothing, tell them nothing, remember your training, meaning not to give up any intelligence if and when they're presumably captured. So the Coast Guardsmen are a little bit surprised. They didn't expect to necessarily have 33 German sailors in the water right in front of them, but they do end up bringing all of them aboard, although the guy minus his leg, he dies shortly thereafter aboard the Icarus. And the U-boat soon sinks of its own accord.
Jeez, that is insane to hear happen. And that you've brought so many questions to my mind here. And so I guess one of them is, what was the standard tactics for a U-boat commander if they had been in this situation? And did Rathka follow those, or did he deviate on his own?
You mean as far as him taking a shot at the cutter, or as far as what happened after that?
The entire thing. Say a U-boat commander had found themselves in this situation. Do you think they even would have attacked to begin with, or do you think he was more ambitious to sink his first ship, and then his actions after that were those kind of standard trying to get away maneuvers by a U-boat, etc., or was he just a poor captain?
Sure. So he clearly, everything that I have seen in going through the research for this, he was clearly desperate due to the aforementioned situation where he had no sinking. So it wasn't unheard of course, for a U-boat commander or any submarine commander to take a shot at something like a cutter or a destroyer. It did happen. Chapter 8 in my book is about the loss of USS Jacob Jones, which was a destroyer sunk off Cape May, New Jersey. So it did happen, and it wasn't against the rules or anything. Their merchant ships were their primary targets, but they were certainly permitted to take a shot at warships as well. The only caveat to that being that's obviously a much higher risk venture. So if you are going to attack a warship, you better make sure that you put it down immediately, right? It's like if you're going to take a shot at a grizzly bear, you don't fire one bullet in its direction and then wait to see what happens. You better put it down immediately. And that was the first error on Ratka's part here, which is that, so he takes a shot at a cutter, which, okay, that's not, doesn't reflect badly on him. They could and did attack warships, but he only fired a single torpedo, which that was common for merchant ships. There was a saying that was popularized by Otto Kretschmer, who was the war's #1 U-boat ace, and his saying was one torpedo, one ship. But that was for merchant ships. Ratka erred badly by firing only a single eel at something that was a prey that was very dangerous and could bite back. What he should have done was fired 3 or 4. Now, as it happens, he almost got away with one because that torpedo very easily could have hit, and if it hit, the Icarus would have been essentially gone, but it didn't. So that was why submarine commanders this era would fire a fan of 2, 3, or 4 when they're going up against something as dangerous as this. So that was really his first error. As far as what Ratka did in the immediate after, in the minutes immediately after that attack failed, he didn't really have many options. So him deciding on the spur of the moment to make a dash for the point where the torpedo had just detonated, that was clever enough. The problem here is that this water is quite shallow. It's only about 120 feet to the bottom where he is. And that adds a whole nother layer of danger for any submarine commander. In fact, during Ratka's interrogation, obviously he didn't admit to being desperate, but he made a remark verbatim. What he said was 30 meters of water or 40 meters of water. What could I do? Meaning the water is so shallow, there's nowhere to run. So he knew that as soon as that attack failed, he knew his options were very limited. And he actually did, given the circumstance, he did kind of the best he could. But he really made a mistake by only firing one torpedo. And I would say he handled the rest of it about as well as he could have. But he put himself into a tough situation due to his presumably desperation.
Okay, that makes sense. So speaking of like the depth of water, that kind of just made something come to my mind. Would other U-boat commanders have been not as inclined to attack possibly in that shallow of water, or like how did that come into play for a U-boat commander possibly attacking a ship?
So that certainly would have been a factor. I don't think, and I've read a lot of U-boat logs, especially from commanders operating along the East Coast, and they submitted very detailed logs. So they oftentimes recorded, I did this because of this reasoning. I was going to attack this ship, but decided not to because of X, Y, and Z. So the log books are really illuminating for purposes of reconstructing these events. So what you mentioned, the water being shallow, that would certainly be part of the tactical calculus that a commander would go through in terms of deciding, am I going to attack this opportunity or not? Other parts of that calculus would be how much illumination, is it day or night? When's the sun going to come up? We've already got depth. We might have how close are they to shore, which might determine how quickly maybe an aircraft could respond to the situation. So there were a lot of factors that were taken into account. Depth could certainly be one of them, but in my experience of reading through a considerable number of these logbooks, that has never stopped. At least I've never come across an incident where the shallow depth stopped anyone from attacking when they otherwise would. So that's a really good question, and it was certainly a factor, but that wasn't usually, I didn't usually deter them from attacking.
Okay, that makes sense. And then to go back a little bit, why was this area such a hunting ground for U-boats off Cape Hatteras? Like, I assume, is it having to do with like shipping lanes or et cetera? Like,
Yeah. So I would pull the map up earlier, but I don't want to mess up the slideshow from where we're at now. The reason, and I think I mentioned this, the reason that this area was such a hot spot of U-boat activity is because of the currents that also make it a particularly stormy region of sea. So there's a thing called the Labrador Current that comes down from Canada, which brings cold water. And there's another one called the Gulf Stream, which brings warm water from the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf Stream is why Britain has mild winters. So the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current, they meet about 150, 200 miles east of Cape Hatteras, which is that part of North Carolina that sticks out the farthest. So because those two currents of very different temperature water meet not far offshore, that means that water out there is very stormy year-round. Rough seas are the norm. So for centuries, this has caused ships, just like it did in this era, that would cause ships to hug the coast to stay clear of the stormy water. But at the same point, they have to be careful on the coast because there's rocks and shoals and all sorts of opportunities for running aground. So what that means is that with stormy water over here and a coast over here, it means that all of the north-south traffic from the Caribbean, the Gulf, and South America, everything going north and everything going south gets canalized into a pretty narrow stretch of maybe 20 miles wide by about 100 miles long, right along North Carolina. So in military terms, it's called a canalizing feature. So the Germans knew that everything going south or north gets funneled through this relatively small strip of water along the coast. So this really the same factors that have caused so many ships to wreck here from storms over the centuries are the same things that made it a particularly lucrative hunting ground for the Germans.
Okay, very interesting. I did not realize that those things came into play into these scenarios. So I just learned something new here. And then so Jester's decisions during this event. So you mentioned that basically the United States had had no success in sinking U-boats up until this point off of their coast. So for Jester, did he keep in line kind of with the current anti-submarine warfare tactics at that time, or did he kind of independently think and that's what helped him sink this U-boat? Or I guess like essentially, because this is during the happy time still, and like I said, like we're basically sinking no U-boats. So how did his decisions like come to be during the event, and essentially like was he thinking on his own? And that's I guess that's what I mean.
Yeah, Jester pretty much was his conduct was really impeccable here. He did exactly what is expected of a commander in his position, not just in general, but even by the expectations of doctrine and tactics of the time. He was his crew was attentive. His crew was clearly well drilled. He was working his patrol route, pinging the sea with sonar, found the U-boat, engaged the U-boat very quickly. That torpedo attack failed, engaged it again and again and again, and forced it to the surface, and then continued to maintain maximum pressure on it until it was clear that it was no longer a threat. And then he picked up the POWs, which obviously had significant intelligence value. So he really did, from start to finish here, he did everything he was expected to do. So he employed the right tactics with the right mindset, because success in battle is not just a matter of doing the right thing, but doing the right thing the right way. And that's why commanding a ship or leading a unit in combat is so difficult, because you have to have not only the knowledge professionally, but you've got to have, there are intangible factors that psychological factors that are needed to be a good commander or combat leader of any sort. So the short answer is Jester really kicked ass here. He did exactly what he was supposed to do in the way he was supposed to do it, and he was very aggressive about it. And the results speak for themselves.
Okay, and then I don't know if there's any actual information about this out there, but did this attack become somewhat of like a blueprint for future engagements, since there was basically nothing to go on previously of successes against U-boats?
So not really, or not necessarily, I should say. A point of clarification is that the Allies had sunk plenty of U-boats up to this point, but it's just that along the U.S. coast, there's only been one destroyed up to this point. So
Okay.
the short answer is no, because Jester didn't do anything out of the ordinary or implement any sort of unorthodox tactic. He just did what he was supposed to do and did it very well. So if anything, it just proved that this is how you destroy an enemy submarine. It was an excellent case study for, and I'm not sure the extent to which it was used in this way, but it was an excellent case study for here's what a anti-submarine commander should do.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So now there's 33 POWs, I think you said. So
Yeah,
what is
and
one of them died, right, or whatever, when they got
yeah.
onto the Icarus? Okay. So what does life kind of then become for them, or like what are the steps then once they get them back to shore?
So the Icarus showed up to Charleston harbor the next morning and offloaded the POWs. You can see them in that photo. They're standing in formation next to the ship. The guys with rifles and bayonets standing around them are Marines from MCRD Paris Island, which was a relatively new installation at the time. So they were housed first at Charleston, and then they were taken. I think Ratka was taken eventually to Fort Hunt in Virginia. I don't know that for certain, but Fort Hunt is where a lot of the officers and commanders were taken for interrogation. There was a lot of that was the interrogation center for U-boat officers to the extent that I understand it. But the rest of them, they were all questioned by naval intelligence. All that information was, of course, put into reports, some of which I used to research this incident. And then eventually they would find themselves among hundreds of thousands of other German prisoners in the rather sprawling POW camp network that was in the United States by war's end. By 1945, there were about 500,000 Axis POWs in the United States, the vast majority of them being German. So these guys would have been split up and ended up at any number of different POW camps after the interrogators got everything out of them that they could get. And I should mention, so those I said those are the POWs, the crew, German crew standing in formation, and here is Ratka looking like a total dweeb. On the same note, there was in 1985 there was a joint reunion held between the Germans and the Coast Guardsmen from the Icarus, and the Germans deliberately did not invite Ratka. He was still alive at the time; they just didn't want him there.
Yeah, so I guess speaking of Ratka, in my brief looking into this, his I guess oddities you want to say, kept coming up over and over. So I guess one of the things that I kept seeing was that these POWs were much more security conscious, it seemed, than other people that had been captured. And even as far as Rathka was heard yelling to them in the water, don't say anything basically about anything. And so basically they didn't get very much information, is what I read at least, from these POWs. And then even in the actual POW camp, I guess Rathka was just overly disciplining men for the most random things. So I guess that kind of goes into what you're saying. He was not liked by his crew up to the point of even not being invited.
Yeah. Yeah, not a popular guy, and unsurprisingly, he was a staunch Nazi as well, which U-boat commanders, U-boat officers kind of ran the gambit on the ideological front. But doesn't surprise me at all that this arrogant martinet that's disliked by his crew. Of course, he's also a National Socialist, so he's almost kind of a comical character. And you know what? He died in 2001. And his career total for ships sunk remained 0.
That's amazing. Kind of poetic, honestly, that someone who was so desperate to prove themselves and such a Nazi was a humongous failure.
Yep. And the actions of Lieutenant Jester earned him the Navy Cross, and he was one of only 6 Coast Guardsmen in World War II that would receive the Navy Cross, which is second only to the Medal of Honor. Navy equivalent, the Army is the Distinguished Service Cross. And just last year, there was a Coast Guard cutter commissioned, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter, Jester, Maurice Jester. I was really intrigued to find out that, and I don't know a whole lot about the unit heraldry and ship's emblems, but there are some interesting features of this emblem. So the dark blue field represents Torpedo Junction, the waters off North Carolina. The black triangle part represents the U-352 lurking under the surface, and then the 3 flaming bombs represent depth charges. And the one that's in the middle of the triangle represents the depth charges that were accurate. And then the chains represent the POWs that were captured. And then finally, there's other parts, but the Icarus was there was a whole class of postcard cutters that got mythological names, Greek mythology. So the Icarus being one of them. Obviously, Icarus, the mythological figure, he is most famous for building these wings out of wax, but he flew too close to the sun, and the wax melted, and he fell and died. So the Icarus wings here are, according to an official website, were chosen to represent Ratka's arrogance and hubris. He flew too close to the sun.
Oh, that is very cool. I had no idea and would have
Yeah.
never known that all of that stuff
I'm
had
not,
such a deep meaning.
yeah, I didn't know till yesterday when I found it. So
Very cool. And then, speaking of the wreck, how was the wreck discovered and when was it discovered?
it was discovered in 1975 or 76. It was, this was obviously it was sunk in an era before GPS. So you can record the coordinates of where the engagement happened, but if you're just doing it the old-fashioned way with a protractor and a map, I mean, it can be hard to find that exact point again. So the wreck was lost after World War II. It was not really seen, wasn't seen or seldom thought of after that. But then the 60s saw the beginning of a wreck diving culture that was really the worldwide wreck diving culture was really largely born along the northeastern United States or along the East Coast, most particularly in the Northeast, but also in North Carolina as well. So it was some of these early pioneers that found the wreck in, I think it was 1976. And it has, by today, evolved into by far the most frequently dived U-boat wreck in the world. There's no doubt about that. And it is also the most frequently dived U-boat wreck in U.S. waters. And it's pretty accessible. It sits only about 120 feet to the sand. The water here, because of the Gulf Stream, is usually pretty warm and pretty clear. The only challenge is that because of the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current, the sea conditions can be very hit or miss. So if you get out on a nice day, it's an awesome dive, and provided that the sea is calm enough, because you don't want to be out in a small boat and swells that are more than 4 feet. So these pictures that I'm going to put on the screen, this one and the next few, I took these in 2020. This was from 2020 as my first dive. And then there's a few more from 2022. That's the forward galley hatch, and then kind of a view inside of it. And then this one was also from my first dive. This one was 2022, and then this one was also from the first dive. The boat lies on her side at a 45-degree angle. And as you can see, there's part of that outer hull has corroded away, not all of it, but there are parts where the pressure hull is fully exposed. But because of the way that submarines are built, their wrecks tend to maintain their structure for much longer than other vessels. So she's still more or less an intact submarine. The guns are gone. They were salvaged. A few of them are at one of the dive shops ashore, but the most of the boat is still there.
Wow. So is there like a bit of an eerie feeling diving on it? Because I assume there's some crew members that are still inside of her to this day, right?
Yeah. So yes, it is a war grave, and it's still legally the property of the German government. I tried to figure out how many Germans would have gone down with the ship itself, because there were a few that would have died on the surface, hit by gunfire. I think there was the number I came up with is probably about 7 that were inside the boat when it went down. I'm not sure the extent to which those remains have been disturbed, because shortly after it had been discovered, for those years immediately following, there were tons of people that went into the boat, took things. Many of those things are on display now at Olympus Dive Shop. Has, I think, most of the stuff. A lot of really cool artifacts. But my point is that this grave has been entered many times, so I'm not sure the extent to which those remains might have been disturbed. Unfortunately, the remains of another U-boat crew that's off Rhode Island, the U-853, those have been extensively disturbed over the years. So, yeah, it is a little bit eerie. There were maybe a half dozen humans that went down with this boat. And that always makes it a little bit, even if not eerie, when you dive any of these wrecks that are war wrecks, the knowledge that this is a grave site adds a little bit extra. It can be a little creepiness, but also it spurs you to make sure you're approaching it with the proper amount of respect. At least it should.
Yeah, so would you go inside or would you not due to it being a war grave? And also, I know it's very risky to dive inside of a wrecked submarine like this.
Yeah. So, good question. There's kind of a few different ways to answer it. Would I personally? Probably not, because of the war grave aspect. Not unless there was some sort of historical value to be achieved from it. I mean, if I ever get to discover a U-boat, that's within diveable depths, I might go try to, get something out of it. That's impossible. There's no more that are unaccounted for like that. But so would I? Probably not. For obviously the fact that that's a very cramped environment is another thing. But in this case, the boat's interior has actually been mostly sealed off. The hatch I showed you earlier, the galley hatch on the forward deck, this one is still open. I don't think you'd have to move that vertical bar to even try to get in there. Not that would be advisable. So no, I didn't go in. No one's been in for a long time. And generally speaking, it should be avoided at a minimum for the safety reasons. But, unless you're doing real archaeological work that's approved, you really should not be going inside a wreck like that. What you bring up is kind of a complicated subject, and it has both legal, ethical, and safety dimensions.
That's a good answer. That's definitely fair. And you mentioned that there's no unaccounted for U-boat wrecks off of America's shores these days. So how many U-boats in total were sunk?
So within 400 miles of the U.S. coast, there were 14 U-boats that were sunk. And not all of them have been found, but I think the only one that has not been found is 521 off kind of Delaware, Delmarva area, but that one's at 2,000 plus feet or something like that. So, but the number is 14 U-boats. And of those, without having my notes in front of me, I think 6 of those are diveable and only maybe 7, but this is the only one that gets really regularly dived. Well, this and the one off Rhode Island are the ones that get regularly dived.
Okay. And then, kind of to tie back to your book here, in your research, what, in your opinion, was the single biggest factor of turning the tide against the U-boats?
So, again, a few different ways to answer that question. I would say that within American waters, it was the convoy system, which I mentioned earlier, and the first leg of the convoy system started running, I should say, on 14 May. So just a few days after this happened. There was an interim solution called the Bucket Brigade that ran for a few weeks prior to that, so starting in April. But it was convoys that shut the U-boats down. Reason being that convoys make ships, hard to find because you're concentrating them all into one group. They're not just sailing individually. And then it makes their ships well defended. And if they sail in daylight, then you're forcing U-boats to attack in daylight, which they don't like to do. And if they're attacking in daylight, that means they're probably attacking submerged. And if they're submerged, they're too slow to chase a convoy. So when you put ships in convoys, and especially if you haven't sailed in the daytime, you really take away most of what a submarine, most of the threat that a submarine can pose. Now, globally, how the tide was turned against the U-boats, I think the single biggest, and I got this question when I was speaking at Johns Hopkins in June. I think the single biggest answer there is radar. I mean, there's a combination of a dozen different things: more escort vessels, new tools like the Hedgehog and the Mousetrap, although those came along a little bit later. More air cover, including the ability to use escort carriers for hunter-killer groups that could hunt down U-boats. Really, I think if I had to pick the most important thing, which is, can't be quantified, but more destroyers helps, but really radar is the big thing, because radar offers a tactical advantage of forcing a submarine to remain submerged. And as I mentioned earlier, if the submarine remains submerged, it can't chase anything. It's too slow. A U-boat tops out at about 7 knots underwater. A convoy, the slowest convoy is running at 9 or 10. So if you take away a U-boat's ability to operate on the surface, you really go a long way to neutering that threat altogether. But in terms of American waters, it was the convoy system. And frankly, it should have been implemented months earlier. It should have been implemented right after Pearl Harbor, but it was not. And it was finally its late implementation in May of 42 that really pushed the U-boats away from the East Coast.
I completely agree with that answer. And I think it was Ernest King's fault, right, that the convoys weren't happening. Yeah. So what everyone always says in my comments, they blame him.
It is. Oh, they're right. They're completely right.
Yeah, and so I guess as the Allies are improving their anti-submarine warfare tactics and technology, how do the Germans then react to the Allies' advances? I know for technology-wise, they had the snorkel, they tried out and everything like that, but was there really anything that they could even do?
So I'll give you an answer that's especially germane. I'll give you a strategic answer instead of a tactical one. So Karl Dönitz, who was the admiral that commanded the U-boat fleet for the entirety of the war, even after he got promoted to Grand Admiral, Dönitz's entire strategy is that it hinged on moving his U-boats wherever on the map they could do the most damage at the least risk for themselves. So the decisive phase of the U-boat campaign, 1939 to 42, and even to a certain extent beyond that, it kind of plays out like a global game of whack-a-mole. They go here until that area is better patrolled and targets aren't so easily found, then they shift somewhere else, then they shift somewhere else. And this is how they came to the East Coast in January 1942, because Dönitz had kind of spent his opportunities elsewhere, and then suddenly this new territory opens up where there's tons of merchant ships and few Allied military resources. So he focuses all his U-boats along the East Coast and North America for a while. So this continued, and in that way, in May of 1942, so the month the story takes place, Dönitz, realizing that his East Coast happy time is running, it's nearing the end of its run, what he does is he starts to shift his U-boats where? The Gulf of Mexico. He just keeps going south. And he'd already been operating in the Caribbean, and they would continue. They started in February, and they would continue that for quite some time. But May of 1942 saw U-boat efforts in the Western Hemisphere begin to focus and converge on the Gulf of Mexico, which was another territory that was, as Dönitz called it, a soft spot. And the Gulf of Mexico was then very bloody for May, June, July, into August, until finally the convoy system was extended to include the Gulf, and then that got shut down. And then by that point, that brings us up to September of 1942, and we see the whack-a-mole game continue as Dönitz shifts the focus back to the North Atlantic. So to answer your question, which I didn't forget, is Dönitz's response to increasing Allied strength at sea was just to keep doing what he had been doing. which worked for a few more months, maybe another almost a year. But eventually he ran out of ripe hunting grounds. Meanwhile, the allies at sea are getting stronger and stronger than ever. It's at that dilemma point that he starts to look more urgently at technological or tactical solutions. But by that point, it was too late. The writing's on the wall. So at this phase, especially May of 1942, his response is to just keep doing what he has been doing. And he doesn't realize or doesn't want to realize that he's only got a few more months of that having, bring any return on investment.
Okay, great answer. We're coming up on about an hour here, so I'll ask you only two more questions here to not take up your entire day, because I could talk for hours about this and keep asking questions. So, one question I had is, what would it have been like to be aboard U-352 as you were under a depth charge attack? Because I know, like the U-505 that's on display in Chicago, its previous commander, not the one that was the commander when it was captured, but the one before, like, I think his name was Peter Zeitz or something like that. Mm-hmm. He actually killed himself under the stress of the depth charge attack.
So the situation with Zeitz was he killed himself for unrelated reasons. It was not during a depth charge attack. Certainly at least, you know what? I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. I should say he did not kill himself directly, primarily as a result of that. Because I read that memoir. I might be wrong. It might have happened during a depth charge attack, but that wasn't why he killed himself. He had been displaying what we would call suicidal ideations for a while, or he had been displaying suicidal warning behaviors for a long time leading up to that. Whatever the circumstances that he killed himself, that was the culmination of many other stresses. Among them would have been included what we would today call PTSD from enduring depth charge attacks. But that wasn't the primary reason. That wasn't the proximate cause of his suicide. It was weird that he killed himself on patrol. That was very strange. I recommend the boat is called, or the book is called Steel Boat Iron Hearts by Hans Gerbler. But to your question about what it would have been like to have been aboard the U-352 during this incident, I will say that the movie Das Boot really gets the reality of a depth charge attack pretty accurate. From everything I've read in terms of U-boat veterans' reactions to those scenes, it really got about as close as you can. So imagine you're already in the tight confines of the submarine. The submarine is almost like it's in a paint can mixer getting thrown around. There are sparks shooting out of instrument panels. In their case, the U-352 got knocked on its side, so you're going to get thrown off your feet and against the bulkhead. If you're unlucky, like the first watch officer, you might get your head smashed against the bulkhead, and that might be the end of you. So the lights went out as well. In fact, specifically, the Germans reported for in this instance, the main lights aboard the U-352 went out, but then the emergency lights kicked on, which were much dimmer. So you've got sparks, you've got the vessel you're in getting tossed around. All the while, you've got in between these waves of depth charges that are landing, you have the sonar pinging off the hull, and at very close range, the submarine veterans have said that sonar at close range off the hull, it actually has like a physical quality. Like one guy, it might have been Hans Gerbler, who I mentioned a minute ago, he mentioned it, or he described it as like sand pinging off the side of the hull, like pebbles or little pieces of particulate. So pretty chaotic. And of course, everyone aboard, even the commander, is for the most part unable to do anything other than weather the storm, grin and bear it. That was supposedly one of the worst parts of that experience. And this is not limited to U-boats either. This would go for other submarines of other fleets, that one of the worst parts is supposedly the fact that you can't do anything about You can't. It's not even like getting shot at, where on land where maybe you could take cover or something or shoot back. You have really nothing you can do other than, depending on the circumstances, try to throw the pursuer off your tail, which sometimes worked. It didn't work very much in this case because Lieutenant Jester found Radka pretty much immediately. But you've got the thing getting shaken around, you've got sparks, you've got the lights going out, you've got water spurting in through breaches in the pressure hull. So it's about as disorienting and terrifying as an experience as you could probably imagine. And the closest thing you could probably get to it is watch the movie Dust Boot.
Yep, fantastic movie, and definitely not an event I want to ever experience in my life for sure, based
Yeah.
on what I've heard.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's about the worst thing that you can go through, and that helpless feeling has to probably be one of the worst parts of it all, as stuff is just exploding around you.
Yeah. Yep.
So I guess to wrap things up here, in your research of your book, what was the most interesting thing that you learned at all? Like, it could be anything. What was the most interesting thing that you learned?
So that's a tough question. I'll share the most interesting thing that comes to mind. I think it would be a part of what I try to focus on, as I mentioned towards the beginning of this talk, is I try to emphasize the human experience of these events. And when I say human experience, I mean, what would it have been like I want to be able for the reader to get a sense of what it would be like for them to be there. So that means capturing things like what you just asked. What was it like to be aboard a submarine that's getting depth charged? What was it like to be a crewman that is abandoning ship? How about abandoning ship from a tanker when the ship and the ocean around it is on fire? So I have a strong interest in painting a realistic picture of what human beings experienced in these events. And consequently, I was really taken aback. I won't say I was surprised, but it really struck me just how many ways these people, and when I say, I mean U-boat crewmen, merchant mariners, naval crewmen of surface ships, just the sheer number of ways to die. I even mentioned that on my on the book jacket of Killing Shore. I think I phrased it as innumerable ways to die, faced by friend and foe alike. Really, you could, if you don't get trapped in the ship when it sinks, if you don't get burned by the oil, if you don't survive, even if you survive all of that, you still might freeze to death floating in the water. Even if you survive that stuff, maybe there's one individual that gets killed by a shark. Well, it was actually a blimp crewman. There was a blimp that was shot down in 1943, and the whole crew survived the crash, and then one of the survivors gets killed by a shark. So there's just an almost infinite list of ways to die, and it really highlights just how dangerous this was for everyone involved: civilian, military, German, American, Norwegian, even neutrals. You can get crushed, you could drown, you can burn, you can freeze to death. It's such a gauntlet of things that are seeking to separate you from, your mortal coil. It's really breathtaking. And that's not even including the guys that served in the Mediterranean and the Arctic that also had to deal with air attacks as well. So it's really stunning just how many ways there are to die, and how terrible so many of those are.
Yep, if there's one thing I've learned, it's being on a merchant ship or a U-boat, probably the two last places I would have wanted to be during the Second World War. Because like you said,
Yeah.
endless problems that you'll be facing or ways that you have to die out there.
Yeah, to say the least.
All right, well, this has been a lot of fun for me.
What I got for you.
Oh, yeah,
Thank you.
This has been incredible. I've learned so much today. Like, like I said, like I keep asking questions for hours, but I don't want to keep you here all day. We're already at like an hour and 10 minutes, so we'll definitely have to do this again sometime because I'm just like the more I'm learning, like the more I'm realizing I don't know about anything, the more questions that are coming to my mind.
Hey, I'm always happy to share, and fortunately for both of us, there is really an endless treasure trove of stories. Like this story gets a page in my book. The book is what 378 pages. So
Jeez, okay.
there's really an all. There's I think as I implied when I sent you that list of ideas during our email exchange, there's really just almost a bottomless amount of of storytelling opportunity here, and I absolutely look forward to whatever it is we partner on next. And thank you again. You have a lot of reach, you have a lot of exposure. Very important for someone like me that's not quite there. For those that have watched this video and enjoyed the content, you can find me on social media at the handles that are shown there on the screen. I have a YouTube channel as well with a few of my public events recorded, and my website, which has, among other things, it lists my upcoming public events. Most of them are in the Northeastern United States, but I'm always looking for new opportunities. So if anyone is part of a museum or historical society and wants to host me for a talk, please don't hesitate to reach out. I have at least one good reference here from my host. Hopefully, hopefully.
Yeah, this has been awesome for me. I'm literally ordering your book right now. I've learned so
Oh,
much.
thank you.
And like you said, the human element aspect of like that you like to focus on, that is what I'm most interested as well. Like when it comes to stuff like this, because those are like, the stories that usually aren't like told in like a documentary or like the
Yeah.
cliche like history book and stuff like that. So being able to learn about stuff like that of like what the human experience was actually like is highly, highly interesting for me. So I'm definitely gonna have to order your book right here, and everyone else
Thank
make
you.
sure to order it as well. What you sell it on Amazon, right?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, it's on Barnes and Noble. All the major retailers in the US and UK, the major book retailers should stock it. It's on Kindle ebook, and the audiobook just came out less than 2 weeks ago. So whatever your flavor of choice is.
Oh, awesome! Did you do the narration for the audiobook yourself?
No, they offered for me to, I guess, I don't know, audition or try out. They said if you're interested in doing the narration, you let us know. I didn't want to do it because I wanted a professional to do it.
Uh,
I'm a big believer in let the professionals. You get the most value if you rely on professionals to do whatever the individual piece of the project is. So the guy that ended up narrating it, his name's David Stifel, and he was awesome. I had heard some audiobooks that he's done in the past, so I knew he was one of the best narrators out there, and he really did a great job with Killing Shore. And in fact, I called him just last week, and I said, "Hey, David, I'm Kay Nelson. Just wanted to let you know how satisfied I was and how appreciative I am of the job you did." And he really appreciated that, but he's an excellent voice actor, and he really did a great job with the audiobook.
awesome. I may have to check that out then. I'm usually anti audiobooks because I like to see the words and everything, but I might have to check that
Yeah.
out. And someone like you is this
Or you can get
knowledgeable
both.
deserve more viewers for sure.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And that's all I got.
Literally goes into the slide here. Perfect. Well, everyone, make sure to go check out Killing Shore, the true story of Hitler's U-boats off the New Jersey coast. Make sure to go check out Kay's YouTube channel here. There's a lot of great content on there. Like I said, extremely knowledgeable. I've learned so much here today, and I thought I knew a decent amount coming into this. And like I said, I realized I really don't know much now. So everyone, make sure to go check out his content, everything that he's doing. If you even just have an interest in naval history at all in general, there's a lot that you can learn here. And thank you again for coming on and letting me take up a lot of your day here. I've had a lot of fun with this. I
Thank
hope you've
you.
had fun. And hopefully we can do
I
this again
did.
sometime soon.
Looking forward to it. Thanks again.
Awesome.